The first, okay, first question that occurs to me to say is, since so far nobody's said anything, now that we've read through the poem once, does anybody want to say something? Just give a reaction or what they thought of it, or what they think is going to come, or what they're interested in finding out more about, or any questions or statements about the book so far. I see a number of people.
I have one.
Yeah.
I have one. So I read this book for the first time, about 1978 or so. And I have the old
Hello?
Norton copy.
Yeah.
And I was, I remember really liking it. And the first time around, and read more of Johnson, and as he published more. But I was actually, not to brag, but I was kind of impressed that I would come home from working a full day. I'm retired now, but I would come home from a full day of work and read this poem and, check out all the notes. It's a lot of work compared to, a lot of other books, but certainly worth it. I'm just wondering, Johnson seemed to have dropped that format in his later books. I mean, he has a lot of quotes, references, but he didn't give all the, he didn't list them all in the back like this. And it's helpful. I just wondered if it intimidates a lot of potential readers, or just to comment on difficulty in a poem like this in general.
That's a good remark. And Johnson was concerned about it himself, and that's why he probably stopped doing that.
Huh.
He put the notes on the back at the request of the editor at Norton, who was Denise Levertov.
Huh.
And Denise Levertov thought that it would be a good idea to have notes, and he thought that would be pretentious, and like you say, it might scare people off to thinking that this was a terrific learned poem that you had to be aware of all this stuff to begin to understand it. He did not like to create that impression. So going forward, he still kept quoting people, but he didn't cite them unless he did in the poem itself. You had to figure that out, or somebody else did. Anyway, he didn't think it was important that it was a quote.
Okay.
Perhaps. I mean, he did think it was important, but that you had to follow. I'm having been sort of more or less assigned to the task of talking to you about the sources for this poem. I feel a little ambiguous too, because I too bought the book very early on and loved it, but I liked the idea that there were all the notes. I've mentioned this before in this group, and so I actually followed up a lot of the footnotes. Some of them I hadn't until recently, but over the 30 years or whatever it's been, I followed out a lot of the sources, but they aren't necessary to the poem. I actually would just sort of started getting interested in the books for their own sake, as he had. So I think that, in fact, I'm going to mention a couple today that I just recently discovered that are in the notes that are actually just great books. The footnote aspect of it for him, sometimes I've printed out a couple of the full citation of what he was referring to, the text. And once you've read that, you don't have to read it. But if you do read it, it just confirms what you read. It's just like really is a footnote, just saying, here's where I got this. Other times, however, there's a lot more resonance, I think. And that's what I'll talk about some of these today. And in fact, I want to start off. I was going to finish with this, but I think I will do it as an invocation. This is Guy Davenport was a friend of Johnson's and came from the same circle of friends that he grew, became a poet amongst. and he wrote an essay. He wrote two introductions to Ronald Johnson and collected them in a book, Geography of the Imagination, which is his collected essays. And there's, I would say, so far, from what I can tell, the best thing written about Johnson that you will find. So I recommend looking up Guy Davenport's, but I want to read you two paragraphs about his citations and how they work for him, whether it's footnoted or not. True imagination makes up nothing. It is a way of seeing the world. The imagination for Ronald Johnson is obviously a more complex process than we normally think it. There is the world to be seen with its hidden harmony, and there is the poet or painter or composer to perform the magic whereby we can possess the artist's vision. There is more. Throughout his poetry, Mr. Johnson is interested to show us the world from multiple angles of vision, not only what he can show us, but what others have seen also, so that we find ourselves not in the company of one poet, but of many, and not only poets. All these voices quoted in Ronald Johnson's poems are other modes of vision which he is allowing to play over the subject along with his own. In the later poems, we have to learn to read two poems at once. This is irrelevant because we aren't going to read this in this session. In the different musics with rapidly refocused vision, as in the unfoldings. So these are two later poems. It may be that next session, when we have a guest speaker, you may hear about some of Johnson's later work. I'll read you a little more. There is a wild freshness about these poems that cannot be accounted for entirely by newness of form and greenness of imagery. In avoiding the traditional forms of the poem, including the super traditional form of modern poetry, capitalized, Mr. Johnson also escaped the emotional cliches that cling to them like ticks to a dog. Things wholly new are perhaps impossible and a bit frightening, like all things fresh and bright. Mr. Johnson's newness is a re-seeing of things immemorially old. In the book of the Green Man, he gives us a new look at Wordsworth and adds Kilvert to the account. It is the conjunction, not the elements, that creates a new light. Mr. Johnson's imagery that seems so wonderfully clean and new has been discovered in out of the way places. Invention, we remember, really means finding. The knowledge he likes to teach us is indeed knowledge all but lost. Okay, that's only, the paragraph goes on. But
Tinker,
yes.
Yeah, what you've just said really resonates with me, because I found, I read the lovely material that you put together and the long Wordsworth poem and so on, and I don't know much about the so-called romantics, the late 18th, 19th century folk. But then I began, I read all of the material, including the various descriptions of this or that and that illustration. And then I remembered, and I went to Wikipedia to look up, romantic British. What he's doing for me, I loved the poem just as it was. I didn't care about the notes. But after I read your material, I thought people like Wordsworth and Coleridge and that bunch and Blake were looking at nature through a very particular lens. And it was a lens in which they were talking about emotion was more important than rational description and whatnot, but they were exacting emotion from the landscape. And that was the era when people, they built ruins, and they built houses, and they built so-called wild places, because it was a way of actually controlling and formulating what nature was going to say to you. So having said that, I then looked back and I thought that, Johnson says at the very beginning something about rich and strange and whatnot. I think he really successfully is doing the same thing. With his quotes and so on, but just in his own right, he's actually presenting And I like what, the person you just read was talking about, his ability to take on sort of different eras and different viewpoints. This is the 18th, 19th century romantics sort of translated, but there. I mean, he really does it. So I was quite excited because I didn't know anything about, I mean, I know about that era from other art forms, and the same thing was going on. But thank you for sending out that material, because boy, it really helped me suddenly think, I see what he's doing. It didn't make me enjoy the poem more. I enjoyed it to begin with, but it made it somehow richer to realize what he was up to when he was writing that.
Perfect. That's what a wonderful comment. All right. So now I want to do something else. Another little bit of reading over stuff. We read the poem last time, but of course we didn't have time to go any further than that. There is, in addition to the separate notes, there is a note about the Green Man at the last page, on page 89.
Yeah.
It is 1, 2, 4 paragraphs long. I think we ought to pay attention to this. We could read it aloud like we do the poem if you'd like. We'd have to have 4 people willing to read a paragraph each. So shall we do that?
Sure.
Any objections? Okay, I'll just pick 4 people at random here. How about Stanty? You want to read paragraph 1?
Sure.
And then let's see, Justin, you want to read paragraph 2? Okay. And Maureen, you can read paragraph 3. And then Tonin, you can read paragraph 4.
Okay.
I'm sorry I skipped you, Mike, but and some other people. But we'll proceed. Okay.
Okay, should I start?
Yeah.
Okay. The Green Man of the title is not a poetic metaphor merely, but is still to be seen in England. It is not uncommon for pubs or inns to be called by his name, a holdover from times when he was a current legend and was deeply associated with Robin Hood and the Green Knight in Greene and the Green Knight. But he is most often to be found today as a face with sad, heavy-lidded eyes occupying the corbel of an arch in churches. There he has branches growing out either side of his mouth, or is bearded in leaves with more foliage springing from the forehead, or is garlanded.
King of the May, or Jack in the Green, he has a persistent history that can be traced back to May Day celebrations throughout Northern and Central Europe. Geoffrey Grigson writes that traditionally on May Day, in the village plays and ceremonies, he was sacrificed, dying for all the death of the plants in winter. In former times, he was also marched in the London Lord Mayor's Day Parade, enclosed in a wooden framework on which leaves were clustered and from which came explosions of fireworks. Chimney sweeps paraded beneath the same pyramidal frameworks on May Day until the 19th century. One imagines them coming like small boxwood topiary, crackling and sparkling through the streets.
Lewis Spence adds a few typical later variant. I have seen him at South Queensferry on the southern shores of the Firth of Forth, where he is known as the Bury Man, a boy on whose clothes large numbers of burrs or seed cases have been so closely sewn that he presents the appearance of a moving mass of vegetation.
He is also seen, of course, in the guise of Archimboldo's portraits of the seasons, or as the fanciful 17th century gardener pictured in herbals and gardening books in a finery of flowers and of vegetables, or the reverse side of a coin as the mandrake, a plant forming itself in the shape of man. The hand that seems to sprout leaves at its wrist that is used in this book is a pseudo mandrake, actually a radish. Its 19th century engraver, copying a 17th century painting of this miraculous radish, was perhaps both over-credulous and over-exuberant. Not only are these illusionistic finger joints, but a thumbnail as well. The World of Wonders, number 3, also mentions, quote, another radish exactly resembling a human hand in the possession of Mr. Bissett, secretary to the Museum at Birmingham in 1802. He declared in his letter that the fingers were quite perfect and that a large sum had been offered for it and refused.
I like the way this note starts off giving you some information, but it ends up with irony, sarcasm, and almost treating it as cant.
Yeah.
But okay, why I wanted to read this was just to have, because I think it's important to realize that the foundation for his enterprise in this book is myth. This is something mythical. Now, what this myth actually is, he tells you as much as anybody knows. So it was suggested that you can Google on the Green Man, and you will come up with not only a Wikipedia article, but a whole bunch of other whole sites devoted to the Green Man. Particularly since the 60s, there's apparently in England there's a bit of a cult. It's associated with sort of hippie philosophy somehow as being something ancient that's being revived. But the thing is, I read all these sites this morning. I read the Wikipedia article, and as far as I can tell, there's a BBC little 5-minute piece that says the true story behind the Green Man. Nobody knows what the Green Man is still. There's evidence that it may have come from the Middle East, or there are green men all over Europe and I guess all over the world. But what it actually meant and what function it had, nobody knows. But it's old, and I think that's one of the things that is important to Johnson's view of this poem, is that we are going to bring in old stuff. So, thank you for reading that. So now I want to move to just a little bit of a consideration of myth. And in particular, again, when we hear from Peter O'Leary next time, I'm sure we're going to when you hear about the overall trajectory of Johnson's poetry, William Blake was extremely important to him. I'm not even sure he shows up in the notes at all this particular time. He probably does though, in a couple of places. But the fact that Blake was a visionary who had an intuitive or a revealed visionary version of the origin and purpose of the world, which he wrote long poems about with his own mythological figures of his own devising, lies behind his own purpose, Johnson's own purpose. But this is about Tonin. This is about the basic theory of what Romanticism is, how it is different than what preceded it. I'm going to read I gave you a whole thing about this. So I'm just reading part of it. From All Religions Are One by William Blake.
Right.
Principle first, that the poetic genius is the true man, and that the body or outward form of man is derived from the poetic genius. Likewise, that the forms of all things are derived from their genius, which by the ancients was called an angel and spirit and demon. Then he goes on to give a couple more, which the author had left out, which I will too. Principle fifth, the religions of all nations are derived from each nation's different reception of the poetic genius, which is everywhere called the spirit of prophecy. Principle sixth, the Jewish and Christian testaments are an original derivation from the poetic genius. This is necessary from the confined nature of bodily sensation. I don't know what he means by that. Maybe somebody else can explain that. Principle 7. All men are alike, though infinitely various, so all religions and as all similars have one source, the true capitalized M man is the source, he being the poetic genius. Okay. Apparently, Blake believed not only that all religions are one and come out of one original source, and that the oldest people would therefore, being closest to the source, would have perhaps the best idea of what life was about and what we were up to. But apparently he even believes that the whole manifestation of the physical universe springs out of an intelligent awareness of a single being. And in Indian religion, this would be called the Atman, I believe. Everything, it's not just all religions are one, everything is one and comes from a single source, a single vision of the universe. And we are merely participating in that, etc. I mean, you could go on about this relation of this to other religious views and so forth, but I just wanted to point out that Blake was therefore always searching for the most antique. And so the only thing that seems relatable to other parts of the poem is, which I went on to here, has to do with the Druids. I thought this was interesting. The Druids were just being discovered at this point in the 18th century. It was just beginning to be grasped that Stonehenge was something really old, and that it had to do with, seemed to have been put up by some religion that preceded Christianity. Now, the notion that anything preceded Christianity was a new idea. We're in a situation here where the Bible is completely revealed truth to most Englishmen, but we have science coming along that's beginning to create an alternate view that has a different time scheme. So in this period, just preceding the Romantics, why they had to reconcile the fact that the world was built in 7 days with the discovery of the last large periods of time. And so someone might tentatively sneak in just a subtle little hint that maybe those days were a little longer than we might have. But still, they were days. You couldn't conceivably go against the idea that the world was built in 7 days. You might start interpreting it more and more metaphorically. So the going between revealed scripture and science was really what lay behind, in a certain sense, what was leading to the Romantics' turn to nature, in which they were finding that God maybe didn't reveal himself so much through scripture. Well, there was a lot of historical reasons for this, but he was also revealing that he would reveal himself in the imagination of man. And so your poetic imagination, this poetic genius that he was talking about, was in fact the source of knowledge. And poets could be using their imagination, that the imagination was telling the truths about the world. Okay, I'm not sure how good I am, this kind of stuff. I did want to say about the Druids, though, that Blake really understood this. Grasped this and followed along. And there was a train of thought in the late 18th century that the Druids, although this was the kind of stuff you had to go through to reconcile this. The Druids, although they preceded Christianity, anticipated it entirely, and that they understood everything about Christianity. So that's the last sentence in here. In effect, it differed from it only in this: they believed in a Messiah who was to come. The Christians, they believed that he was to come, and we believe that he has come.
Right.
So, but the idea of the and there's a guy mentioned in here, William Stukeley, in the notes will be referred to. Stukeley was one of the one of the discoverers, so to speak, or the theorists about what Stonehenge really was. Now, curiously, as we reread this poem, we'll remember that Stukely is talked about in terms of his garden, his weird little grotto garden that he made, and he made a garden that would imitate, like you were talking about, Tone, and this imitation business of making your own little model. He made a model of Stonehenge in his garden. So that gets it into the poem. His ideas about Stonehenge, of course, were a little odd, particularly since you have to reconcile it with scripture. And so the question of where to put them, in fact, there were two Adams. That's the other thing that was part of the mythology of the time. You had to deal with the Garden of Eden, that Adam. But then you also had the fact that the entire universe was wiped out, the world was wiped out by a flood. And so Noah was like a second Adam. And you had to deal with everything coming out of Noah. Noah's Ark had to contain all of creation and save it and have it start all over again. So to the scientists in particular, why this whole business about the ark, and obviously when you've got the notion of evolution coming along, big problem there, because everything was supposed to be exactly as it is now. They had to worry about extinction, like if things were going to become extinct, that would be like a sin. God made this. How could something God made disappear? So they have to argue, well, it didn't really disappear. It's just not here anymore. It must be in some other country. There's going to be still, stuff that we think of as extinct. Anyway, this was the point at which the Romantic movement began, and they were suspended between a scriptural view of things and a mythological kind of view and scientific view. Okay, what else did I want to read you? Oh yeah, here's a footnote, which alludes to this stuff. Alexander Porteous.
Oh yeah.
Is mentioned in a note saying if you want to know about the Zeus oak connection and lightning, you can check it out in Alexander Porteous. So I included this in this packet.
Yeah.
This from a book called Forest Folklore, Mythology, and Romance, about how it was that the ancient Greeks connected the oak to Zeus. And since Zeus had lightning, well, then you got to have lightning connected also to the oak. You can read this on yourself. I don't need to read this aloud. That's why that's in there. But what interested me was also I hadn't particularly noticed this, and I hadn't followed up this footnote, because it really does just simply explain why the oak and might be connected, and why Ronald Johnson might believe it. But I thought, wow, this is a great book. Forest Folklore, Mythology, and Romance. Here are the contents, just to give you some idea of what's in this book. You can get this. I downloaded it. You can get it.
Yeah, the woolen things in there are bound for the freezer. Did you take some out?
No, I just put one thing back in.
Okay, fine.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I don't know about this timing. I mean, I'm ready, but I don't know.
Jenny, you're not muted.
God. Oh shit.
Mute yourself, honey.
Okay. All right. Contents. Chapter 1, Forests of Eld, Archaean Forests, Primeval and Tropical Forests, Cosmogonic and Traditional Forests. Chapter 2, Fabulist Forests, Forests of Romance and Myth. Chapter 3, Forestry Ban, Forests or Royal Forests, Early Forestry, The Moon's Influence. Ancient Foresters, Forest Customs. Chapter 4, Groves, Earliest Temples, Druids, Classic Groves. Chapter 5, Mythical Denizens of the Forest and Woods, Spirits of the Forest, Witches, Fairies, Demons, Wood Spirits, Wild Huntsmen, Wood Nymphs. Chapter 6, Trees in General, Shadows of Trees, Trees as the Origin of Mankind, Worship of Trees, Transformations into Trees, Trees presiding over marriages, Trees planted at births, Arboreal Tribes, Burial on Trees, Funereal Trees, Ellesmere Tree, Christmas Tree, Genealogical Tree, Devil Trees, Guardian Trees, Abode Tree, Speaking Trees, Life Tree, Bull Oaks. Trees continued, Mythical Trees, Sacred Trees, Traditional Trees, Famous Trees, Curious Trees, Marvelous Trees. Chapter
Wow.
7, Folklore. This is actually meaningful, as I discovered by reading more about Johnson's way of looking at the world, is that he actually argued that humans were, that this, Blake talked about a primitive, a man, the original man view, human being. He actually thought that maybe our primordial consciousness was more like a tree. So
Oh,
he
you mean
no doubt
that-
read this
isn't
whole
that
book very
title?
vividly, and I think I'm going to too.
Well, he has that book, a whole book, a line of poetry of rose trees.
Yep. And the first lines of Radios involves a tree being erected. That's a later book of his. Okay. To continue our dealings with what was Romanticism, I thought we might read together the Tintern Abbey poem.
Yeah.
Because when he went on the trip up the Wye, he was reproducing, among many other trips, Wordsworth's expedition with his sister up the Wye. What for Johnson would have been 100 years ago, and for us is like getting to be, or 150 years ago, and for us is going to be close to 200 years. So how many people we got here? 1, 7. I see 8, assuming that Jenny can't participate because.
Hello?
Hi there.
I tried earlier and I could hear you, but you couldn't hear me.
Okay, well, we can hear you now.
Okay, good.
Do you want to participate? Do you have a copy
Sure.
of Tintern?
Oh, no.
You don't have it. Okay.
No, I probably should have gone to Woodland Pattern and
Oh, no problem. No problem.
Yeah.
It's okay. It's just Stanty, Mike, Michaels, Maureen, Tonin, Mike, Justin, and Chuck. Do you all have copies of this poem?
I don't.
Yes.
I don't.
No. Okay. But how about Jenny?
Find it.
Anyway, I've divided it into 8 sections, so we could read one paragraph each. The first person, Stanty doesn't have it, so I'll start off, and then we can go. I can read the first stanza. The second stanza. How do I do this? Second stanza, Michaels could read.
No, I can't. I can't find it. I haven't found the
yeah, got
Tintern Abbey yet.
Okay. How about Maureen? Can you read the second stanza? You're muted.
Tinker, I'm sorry.
It's going to be.
That's
Did
okay.
you send us a copy with all your attachments?
I did, but if you don't
Okay.
have it in front of you, it
I
might be
do,
hard.
Which
Okay.
one is it? I just got them.
Oh, okay.
So,
Well, 4 pages of it is called Lines Composed a Few Miles Above Tintern Abbey.
okay, I'll look for that, sure. I have Secrets at Hafford. Long Journey, which is 7. It must be one of the early ones, huh?
Page number 2, 3, 4, and 5.
Oh, okay. 2, 3, okay. 2, let's open 2. Okay, got it.
Okay. So you can read the second stanza,
All right.
right? Mike, why don't you read the third stanza? And now the fourth stanza, I can break into, why don't you, Tonin, why don't you read about half of it and just stop?
Okay,
And I'll,
I'll mark it.
okay. And then Chuck can read the rest of that. And then Justin, you could read read the beginning of the last stanza. And about halfway through there, after it says it's full of blessings, you can stop. And have you got a copy of this? Sorry, I panic on names. I got 2 empty blocks here. Who is
Again, there's Carl, are the 2 phones.
Carl? Carl, are you there?
Yeah, I can't, I don't have it to read.
You don't have it.
so-
Okay, I'll read the
yeah,
I'll finish it off.
Mike, can you put it up on the screen?
Oh, yes, of course. That's a wonderful.
That would be very helpful. Yeah.
Sure.
Hold on a second here. Give me like 1 minute, just so
All
I can
right.
Yeah.
way that will.
That might make it easier, then everybody can see the words
And everybody could read.
and everybody could read. Yeah. And Tinker can prompt us.
Right. So I'm not very experienced at leading these things. I'm sorry.
You're doing
Yeah,
fine.
but you can say,
Great.
Maureen, you're up, you know?
Okay, if I can remember, I just sort of like spewed these out.
Well, once
But
it-
anyway, I'll start off, okay?
Okay, go for
Is
it.
it on the screen?
Now, that- Mike, you
Mike
just,
is working on
you have
putting
the
it,
document open?
Well, because it's in separate pages, I'm trying to bring them up in such a way that I can easily toggle between the pages.
Oh, okay,
okay.
yeah,
This is the document.
that sounds good. Yeah,
I'm just trying to do that very quick. Oh, one other thing, actually, I maybe have a different idea here. I'm sorry, give me a moment. Technical.
Well, I can mention a few things about this poem that that are, as I say, he wrote this on a walking tour, just like, this is for section 2
Mhm.
in the poem, is a diary of a trip that he and Jonathan Williams made up the Y, which duplicates very closely what Wordsworth had done. Wordsworth came back. Remember, he had been on a hike here earlier, so the first few lines mentioned that he'd been there before.
perfect.
We got it on screen now. Great.
Yeah, we got it.
Okay. He's been. I'll just mention one other little critical thing because I've got interested in this poem because he wrote this poem almost entirely while walking and memorized it, and walked into his printers when he got home, before he got home, even just while he was still on the walk, and recited it and wrote it down for the printer from memory.
That's-
Lines composed a few miles above Tintern Abbey on revisiting the banks of the Wye during a tour. The other thing to point out is Tintern Abbey isn't, although that's everybody talks about this, is the name of this poem, it doesn't actually occur. It was 5 miles above Tintern Abbey.
Abbey.
It doesn't have anything good, Tintern Abbey was an interesting place. Scholars have written there's a whole thing about how at the time there were homeless people living in Tintern Abbey. And how could he write a poem about Tintern Abbey and ignore these homeless people? Well, so it took another scholar to point out that there is nothing in here. And furthermore, he actually mentions Wordsworth was very interested in the homeless people of his time, actually, and he even mentions it in the first stanza. 5 years have passed, 5 summers with the length of 5 long winters. And again, I hear these waters rolling from their mountain springs with a soft inland murmur. Once again do I behold these steep and lofty cliffs that on wild secluded scenes impress thoughts of a more deep seclusion and connect the landscape with the quiet of the sky. The day has come when I again repose here under this dark sycamore and view these plots of cottage ground, these orchard tufts, which at this season with their unripe fruits are clad in one green hue and lose themselves amidst groves and copses. Once again, I see these little hedgerows, hardly hedgerows, little lines of sportive wood run wild, these pastoral farms green to the very door, and wreaths of smoke sent up in silence from among the trees, with some uncertain noses, as might seem, of vagrant dwellers in the houseless woods, or of some hermit's cave, where by his fire the hermit sits alone.
These beauteous forms, through a long absence, have not been to me as is a landscape to a blind man's eye, but oft in lonely rooms and mid the din of towns and cities, I have owed to them in hours of weariness, sensations sweet, felt in the blood and felt along the heart, and passing even into my purer mind with tranquil restoration. Feelings too of unremembered pleasure, such perhaps as have no slight or trivial influence on that best portion of a good man's life, his little, nameless, unremembered acts of kindness and of love. Nor less, I trust, to them I may have owed another gift of aspect more sublime, that blessed mood in which the burthen of the mystery, in which the heavy and the weary weight of all this unintelligible world is lightened, that serene and blessed mood in which affections gently lead us on, until the breath of this corporeal frame and even the motion of our human blood almost suspended, we are laid asleep in body and become a living soul, with an eye made quiet by the power of harmony and the deep power of joy, we see into the life of things.
If this be but a vain belief, yet oh, how oft in darkness and amid the many shapes of joyless daylight, when the fretful stir unprofitable and the fever of the world have hung upon the beatings of my heart, how oft in spirit have I turned to thee, O sylvan Wye, thou wanderer through the woods, how often has my spirit turned to thee.
And now, with gleams of half-extinguished thought, with many recognitions dim and faint, and somewhat of a sad perplexity, the picture of the mind revives again, while here I stand, not only with a sense of present pleasure, but with pleasing thoughts that in this moment there is life and food for future years. And so I dare to hope, though changed, no doubt, from what I was when first I came among these hills, when like a roe I bounded o'er the mountains, by the sides of the deep rivers and the lonely streams, wherever nature led, more like a man flying from something that he dreads than one who sought the thing he loved. For nature then, the coarser pleasures of my boyish days and their glad animal movements all gone by, to me was all in all. I cannot paint what then I was. The sounding cataract haunted me like a passion. The tall rock, the mountain, and the deep and gloomy wood, their colors and their forms, were then to me an appetite, a feeling, and a love that had no need of a remoter charm by thought supplied, nor any interest unborrowed from the eye.
That time is past, and all its aching joys are now no more, and all its dizzy raptures. Not for this faint eye, nor mourn, nor murmur. Other gifts have followed. For such loss, I would believe abundant recompense. For I have learned to look on nature, not as in the hour of thoughtless youth, but hearing oftentimes the still, sad music of humanity, nor harsh, nor grating, though of ample power to chasten and subdue. And I have felt a presence that disturbs me with the joy of elevated thoughts, a sense sublime of something far more deeply interfused, whose dwelling is the light of setting suns, and the round ocean, and the living air, and the blue sky, and in the mind of man, a motion and a spirit that impels all thinking things, all objects of all thought, and rolls through all things. Therefore am I still a lover of the meadows and the woods and mountains, and of all that we behold from this green earth, of all the mighty world of eye and ear, both what they hath create and what perceive, well pleased to recognize in nature and the language of the sense, the anchor of my purest thoughts, the nurse, the guide, the guardian of my heart and soul of all my mortal being.
Nor perchance, if I were not thus taught, should I the more suffer my genial spirits to decay. For thou art with me here upon the banks of this fair river, thou my dear friend, my dear, dear friend, and in thy voice I catch the language of my former heart, and read my former pleasures in the shooting lights of thy wild eyes. Oh, yet a little while may I behold in thee what I was once, my dear, dear sister, and this prayer I make, knowing that nature never did betray the heart that loved her. 'Tis her privilege, through all the years of this our life, to lead from joy to joy, for she can so inform the mind that is within us, so impress with quietness and beauty, and so feed with lofty thoughts that neither evil tongues, rash judgments, nor the sneers of selfish men, nor greetings where no kindness is, nor all the dreary intercourse of daily life shall e'er prevail against us or disturb our cheerful faith, that all which we behold is full of blessings. Therefore let the moon shine on thee in thy solitary walk, and let the misty mountain winds be free to blow against thee. And in after Sorry, was I supposed to stop?
It's okay. You might as well finish it. Why don't you just read it?
I think I lost my spot.
Okay. And in after years, when these wild ecstasies, it's about halfway down the page. Right at the, what's on the screen. If you're reading from there, it's right at the top of the page.
Oh, okay. And let the misty mountain winds be free to blow against thee. And in after years, when these wild ecstasies shall be matured into a sober pleasure, when thy mind shall be a mansion for all lovely forms, thy memory be as a dwelling place for all sweet sounds and harmonies. Oh, then, if solitude or fear or pain or grief should be thy portion, with what healing thoughts of tender joy wilt thou remember me, and these my exhortations? Nor perchance, if I should be where I no more can hear thy voice, nor catch from thy wild eyes these gleams of past existence, wilt thou then forget that on the banks of this delightful stream we stood together, and that I, so long a worshipper of nature, hither came unwearied in that service? Rather say with warmer love, oh, with far deeper zeal of holier love. Nor wilt thou then forget that after many wanderings, many years of absence, these steep woods and lofty cliffs, and this green pastoral landscape were to me more dear, both for themselves and for thy sake.
Well, thank you. This poem is beloved by English teachers because they can, it seems to be like a manifesto of how you know, of what Wordsworth, you know, an analysis of how you know, what nature did do for him, and how important could it be. And what's among the things that are interesting to me is that he gets to what you might think of as the end of the poem, and then he goes on, he says, no, but actually what's really important is that I'm sharing this with my sister. Yeah. The fact that there is another person that he goes through this with, it turns out to be, from his point of view, maybe the most important thing, that it isn't just for himself, that it's for everyone, or for another. Anyway, I thought that is interesting. Aspect, well, the various things. There's where he talked about the blessed mood in which the burden of the mystery, in which the heavy and weary weight of this intelligible world is lightened, that serene and blessed mood in which the affections gently lead us on until the breath of this corporeal frame and even the motion of our human blood almost suspended, we are laid asleep in body and become a living soul. Well, clearly he's talking about a move from like looking or feeling about nature into a meditation. Even mentioning the slowing of the breath. But he's paying attention to the breath.
It ought to be an anthem for the people who are observant about climate change.
Yeah, that too. Actually, I think myself, after a long time, we can remove this poem from the split screen, I think. Yeah, thank you. I believe that one of the things that was fostering the romantic change in things, the attention suddenly to nature, was the Industrial Revolution and an intuition on the part of the sensitive people at that time that this was really screwing things up. Not only economically, in which people were thrown out of work in the countryside and moved into the cities to man these factories, but you know, the air pollution and water pollution, everything that was happening, I think they began to sense already at that point that the world was in danger. And so, of course, suddenly, instead of thinking of the nature as wilderness, as a dangerous place, it suddenly became something to be valued. And so I think you're right onto something here, Maureen.
It's also kind of interesting that when he talks about essentially the body slowing down, close to ceasing to exist, so what he calls the soul can come forward. And then you have Blake with his poetic genius. It's this ineffable, boy, do I hate that word, but this ineffable thing, which is not the body. You know, the old dichotomy between body and soul, or body and mind, is very powerful here. There's a kind of yearning to bring forth whatever that is.
Right, exactly. Yep. That's romanticism in a nutshell, perhaps.
Yeah. Well, to get rid of all the ugly stuff that we drag around with us, you know?
Yeah. Well, I've just got a few more things that I wanted to mention. I mean, I sent you the stuff which you can read yourself, which are aspects of the aspects of the notes, things that I looked up and decided to print out for you. I might mention there is some talk about Hafod when they go up the Y. He talks about visiting Hafod. Hafod was a scene, was an estate that the person who owned it decided to develop into a perfect picturesque landscape, a wild, romantic kind of a place to look at that he'd make on his own. And so all kinds of clergy, not only clergymen, but all the thinking people of all kinds would flock to this place to take a look at Halfwood, what it was. So I printed out for you the only part I could find, the book by George Cumberland, Scenes of Visiting Halfwood, is very hard to get hold of these days. So I couldn't like read that whole book, but there was a section of it that's in an anthology that I printed out for you. Also on that, there's as a footnote, he says you can read what Tintern Abbey actually looked like in those days. And so there's a description of that I also found. All these things come from an anthology by Jeffrey Grigson. Jeffrey Grigson was somebody that Ronald Johnson actually went to visit. He was such a fan of his. I mentioned him in the first batch of stuff that I sent around. He was a poet. The poets in the 40s were among those people who, because of perhaps of surrealism, there were so many of them were interested in surrealism, which was a continental thing that was going on at the same time. They became more interested in romanticism. So this strain of romanticism that comes to Ronald Johnson came out of Britain, did come out of a group of poets in the 40s. And Grigson was one of these. And another one was a guy named, his name is spelled Ruthven. Apparently the Welsh pronounce this Ruven. They don't pronounce the TH. Ruven Todd. And he wrote a wonderful book, which really anticipates everything that we're talking about here about the intersection of science and mythology and the kind of an interest in making these. That's why the last page I gave you a picture of a pictorial museum exhibit with biological things mixed in with plants and horrible. It looks like organs from cutting people apart and so forth. So that's Ruven Todd was a friend of Grigson's. And these pages, this scenes from Halfwood and Tintern Abbey, they all come out of this book called The Romantics, which was an anthology that he put together that included not just poetry, but science writing. And this seems clearly to have been a huge influence on this poem of the Book of the Green Man. And just in the very fact of bouncing a bunch of quotes together, I mentioned this in my first packet, I get the sensation that it's quite a bit like reading Johnson to actually read a few pages. But I did read this, I'll read you this one last little thing aloud, just that I sent out to you on the last page. It's a long and involved journey from the apologetic tones of the 17th century natural philosopher to the early 19th century scientist strictures upon Descartes. Quote, but in philosophy he failed, his genius taking a wrong turn through the brilliancy of his imagination, which led him to invent systems of nature instead of investigating her laws by means of judicious experiments, painfully and patiently pursued. Well, that's the scientific method at the end is way ahead of where these people were. They were at an intermediate zone where they could just like deal with the discoveries of science and make poetry out of it. 4, I'll go on with reading it. Yet between the apologists, that is the people who apologize for the Bible as the whole explanation for all of nature, and those who insisted upon experimentation as the proper duty of every right-minded man, there lies the country with the wonderful mine of bright and glittering ore, where the poets and artists could quarry to their heart's content, knowing that even the pyrites and quartz they carried to the surface, gold and diamonds in the strange half-light underground, would attract an audience for whom the world was still an object small enough for them to cuddle in their hands, like a bubble glass of brandy.
Nice. This is Grigson. What is his name?
Actually, this is Ruven
Oh,
Todd.
this Reverend, yeah.
Yeah, and the name of his book is called Tracks in the Snow, and it's one of the first articles. There's a more recent book called The Age of Wonder.
Mhm.
I don't know if you've heard about that. It was a bestseller in the Times. It's about the same period, the early Romantic, late 18th century scientists and their involvement with poets. Well, this Tracks in the Snow was an essay that covers exactly the same territory.
This Reverend Todd was it Todd, the last name?
TODD, yeah.
Yeah, okay.
Tracks in the Snow. The book's out of print, but I managed to get a used copy cheap, so I guess it's not been discovered. Many of these other books that are referred to in the notes, you can't buy for hundreds of dollars.
Sure.
Which is too bad. Okay, well, I think that's all I need to cover for now. That's like the first two sections. The third section of the poem, as you may remember, is about science and about the scientists cutting things apart. And it starts to, but it's mixed in with Christopher Smart. And if we'd had more time, I would have us read a little Christopher Smart, or I would read Christopher Smart to you, but you can do that on your own. He's a amazing poet who was sometimes, however, also interested. He was a completely Christian maniac who was obsessed with prayer. But his techniques in writing poetry came so directly out of his consciousness that it created a model for modern poets to follow. It's crazy but wonderful poem. So that's quoted along with the scientists in the third section. And the last section, I hope we'll have time I can do a little more. That's based basically on the painter. What's his name? I get blocked about names.
Palmer.
Samuel Palmer. And so you really should look at some Samuel Palmer paintings in preparation for the last section of the poem. Any questions or comments?
Wow.
Yeah, that's the right word. Wow.
When you talk about last section, you're talking autumn?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, the poem, of course, is a seasonal poem like James
Sure.
Thompson's, but he starts in what seemed to be an odd place, doesn't it? He starts with winter.
Yeah.
And ending with autumn is a little odd, but he starts with winter because he's going to, as you may remember, he talks about Wordsworth and Wordsworth's sense of vision, and it seems that he wants to try and recover that, to experience again, looking at nature. But he's standing there in the lake country at Wordsworth's grave and imagining Wordsworth's body being spread in the dirt, and he can't feel anything. It's dead of winter. So that's where the poem begins. That's why it begins with winter. It's trying to begin to recover feeling, and so we have bird sounds. So then you move on through the seasons.
Nice. Thank you for this, Tinker. This background stuff is wonderful.
Well, you can keep going. As I say, I've got a whole stack of.
Oh my gosh.
A whole stack of books. See that little stack of book down there on the floor? I don't have a zoom on here, but that's just some of the material that I've looked at various times. And and as I say, I discover new things every time I look at the notes.
Well, thanks a lot, Tinker.
Sure.
Great.
Yeah. So what do we want to do now? Does anybody else have anything that they've noticed or want to share?
Why don't you tell us a little bit about our guest next time?
Oh, well, next time Peter O'Leary is going to be our guest. and we'll be able to ask him questions and stuff. He's the executor of Ronald Johnson's estate, and he considered himself an apprentice to Johnson at one point. And he's quite a wonderful poet. Chuck can tell you more about his poetry, and should.
Well, what I know,
Peter considers himself a poet of the religious turn, as he puts it, and Christopher Smart is also very much a model for Peter's sort of enthusiastic, lyrical, spiritual concerns. But he's not like a proselytizer, you know. But he is a believer, I think. But he also works in some shorter forms, more concrete visual forms. And I think that, and at least for me, the first time reading through the book of the Greene Man, I was seeing and hearing some of those visual rhymes. I think at some point it might be nice to tune our eyes and our ears to those by looking at some of Ronald Johnson's Eyes and Objects, and maybe some of the visual elements of the longer poem Arc. And Peter will speak to some of that too, I'm sure.
very well.
Yeah. So that's what we got to look forward to next week. One thing I was thinking about was my old mentor, Paul Metcalf, was always talking about, he used text in a different way than Johnson. He was much more interested in friction, but he talked about having two texts next to each other, and the tension between them, or and in Ronald Johnson's case, I'd say the harmony between them, as being the poem. You know, the like if you hear a good choral group, it's hard to tell you what the melody is because the melody happens between the notes instead of on them. So it's just a thing to think about.
I could share with you what I realized what I like about this particular book of Johnson's, is its particularity. That as the poem gets towards the end, it becomes a recitation, one after the other, of things seen, literal, specific things seen. And it becomes a musical piece or a hymn. There's no telling how many different ways you could characterize it, but it is so concrete. We'll probably be, next time we'll be exposed to some of Johnson's other modes of writing, but this was the most concrete. And that's why, for me, still, it's my favorite of his books.
When I
Well,
came,
Go ahead,
sorry.
Stanley.
when I came,
I don't have anything to say.
when I came upon this book, as I said years ago, when I was really first getting into poetry, and I kind of started getting into contemporary poetry with Charles Olson, and from what I remember of in the beginning of projective verse, Olson's theoretical statement, he's saying he contrasts what he's doing to Wordsworth. I think, doesn't he call Wordsworth the egotistical sublime? And I was as I was an amateur stumbling through this, so I didn't even look at romantics, but then I came through, I got to Johnson through other Black Mountain poets and Guy Davenport. And then it was kind of good to see, well, no, those people the romantics have something to offer too. And it was, don't just be, I've been since then integrating, the whole Olson Black Mountain group with romantics and other periods. But all of a sudden, it was a switch on me because they happened in very few years, all of a sudden, well, here's what, look at this part of Wordsworth and the visionary. So that was
Right.
cool.
That's a great remark. Yeah. Actually, Johnson dedicated his first book, A Line of Poetry, A Line of Trees, to Olson. And apparently Olson ignored that and said, why did he do that? And so apparently Olson had no interest in Johnson. Perhaps because of the turn into full out romanticism. Of course, Olson liked Keats, right? Keats' letters were important to him. So it's not like he was utterly against the romantic individuals, but he had a very different take. I hope you all could have better feelings about Wordsworth for us reading a poem together. There is various times. He certainly became a horrible reactionary personage and not very attractive in his later years. But his early poetry was obviously not only revolutionary for everybody who came afterwards, but well worth still reading, I think.
Well, thanks for getting us into it today.
This has been very helpful, Tinker. Thank you so much.
Okay.
Thanks.
And obviously, if anybody has any questions, comments, or anything, and they want to email me with a private question, or just like outside of the forum of this group, where you're welcome to. I can tell you my email because it's only 8 letters. It's Tink, Tink, at WELL.com.
Well done. Thank you. Yep, that's good.
Great. Well,
Yeah,
it's wonderful sharing this time with you.
Thanks so much.
Yeah, it was terrific.
Very good.
Very much.
And thanks to you all. And then we'll be back here in 2 weeks for Peter O'Leary, which will be fantastic as well. So thanks.
Okay.
Bye.
Bye, everyone. See you in a couple weeks.
Goodbye.
Yep.